In the summer of 1969, Los Angeles became the stage for a nightmare that would redefine the American notion of evil. At its center was a man with wild eyes and a prophet's voice, Charles Manson. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a manipulator, a man who convinced others to kill for him. The Manson family, as his cult came to be known, carried out a series of gruesome murders that shocked the world, including the killing of actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant at the time. Manson's name would become synonymous with madness, counterculture gone wrong, and the dark side of charisma. But few people know that behind the chaos, behind the messianic rants and prison tattoos, Manson was also a father. Over the years, he had 3 sons, each born to different women, each condemned to live under a name that history had turned toxic. Their lives became ghost stories of their own lives, shaped by the shadow of a father they could never truly escape. Who were Charles Manson's children? How did they live knowing their father orchestrated one of the most infamous crimes in American history? And what happens when your bloodline is a reminder of pure evil? This is the story of Charles Manson and his 3 sons. A story of shame, denial, disappearance, and the search for identity in the aftermath of terror. Charles Mills Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was a 16-year-old alcoholic drifter who gave birth to him out of wedlock. His father, Colonel Walker Scott, vanished before the boy ever took his first steps. From the very beginning, abandonment defined Manson's life. His mother spent time in prison for robbery, leaving him to be raised by relatives and shuffled between reform schools. What emerged from that fractured childhood was a boy who learned to manipulate charm and deceive skills he would later wield with terrifying precision. By his teenage years, Manson was already immersed in crime, stealing cars, committing burglaries, and drifting through juvenile detention centers. Prison became both punishment and education. Behind bars, he studied human behavior, learning how to read people's desires and weaknesses. He also found a way to turn his loneliness into control. When he was released in 1967, during the height of the hippie movement, America's counterculture became his new classroom, and the lost souls of that era became his followers. Manson moved to California, gathering a group of young runaways and dreamers who believed he was a spiritual leader. He fed them LSD poetry and fear preaching, that he was the reincarnation of Jesus, and that a coming race war, what he called helter-skelter, would destroy society. His followers, mostly women, called him Charlie. They surrendered their names, their will, and ultimately their morality to his. But before the cult, before the murders, Manson had tried, at least superficially, to live a conventional life. He married twice, first to Rosalie Willis, a waitress from West Virginia, and later to Leona Candy Stevens, a woman with a criminal past. From these relationships came his first 2 sons, Charles Manson Jr. and Charles Luther Manson. Years later, during his time in prison, another son, Valentine, Michael Manson, known later as Michael Brunner, was born to his devoted follower, Mary Brunner. 3 boys, each born into different worlds, but bound by the same curse, the last name, Manson. None of them would ever truly escape what their father became. By 1968, Charles Manson had transformed from a petty criminal into the self-styled prophet of a cult. His family, as he called it, lived in a commune on the Spahn movie ranch outside Los Angeles, where drugs, isolation, and Manson's delusional sermons fused into a dangerous ideology. To his followers, he was a savior. To outsiders, he was invisible until the summer of 1969, when the world learned his name in blood. On August 8th and 9th, under Manson's orders, his followers invaded 2 homes in Los Angeles and committed the murders that would define an era. Actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, was among the victims. The brutality of the killings stunned the nation and shattered the illusion of the peaceful summer of love. Overnight, Charles Manson became a symbol of corrupted counterculture, a man who weaponized music, drugs, and ideology to bend others to his will. The family members were quickly arrested, and Manson's trial in 1970 became a spectacle unlike any in American history. With an X carved into his forehead, he ranted about revolution and the apocalypse. The press couldn't look away. Cameras fixated on his hypnotic stare, while his followers, mostly women, sat outside the courthouse singing songs and carving the same mark into their own foreheads. When the verdict came, Manson and several of his followers were sentenced to death a sentence later, commuted to life imprisonment after California abolished the death penalty. For the world, the case was closed. But for his children, it had only begun. Charles Manson Jr. Already a teenager, saw his father's face plastered across every television screen and newspaper. His name, once ordinary, had become a curse. Charles Luther Manson, the second son, disappeared from public records almost completely. And Michael Brunner, the youngest, was just a toddler being raised by relatives who feared the stigma that would follow him for life. As their father's world collapsed, the Manson sons became invisible. The sins of their father had not only destroyed his followers, it had erased his family. In the years following Charles Manson's conviction, the fallout from his crimes extended far beyond the courtroom. While he ranted from his prison cell, giving interviews and scrawling cryptic messages on walls, his three sons grew up under the crushing weight of his infamy. They were never part of the family, yet their lives became irrevocably shaped by it. The moment the world learned their father's name, their own futures changed forever. Charles Manson Jr., the eldest, was born in 1956 to Manson's first wife, Rosalie Willis. By the time of the murders, he was already in his teens, old enough to understand who his father was and what that meant. Classmates taunted him. Employers turned him away. Everywhere he went, the Manson name followed a curse stamped on every form, every introduction. Despite changing his last name to White, the association was impossible to erase. He tried to build a normal life, marrying and having a child of his own. But the psychological burden proved too heavy. In 1993, Charles Manson Jr. took his own life with a gunshot to the head while parked on a desolate Colorado highway. In his car lay his driver's license, proof of an identity he could never escape. The second son, Charles Luther Manson, born in 1960 to Leona Candy Stevens, disappeared almost entirely from public record after his father's arrest. Stevens had testified against Manson in exchange for his release from prison years earlier, and after the murders, she severed all contact. Rumors suggest Luther changed his name, possibly relocated overseas, and chose to live under complete anonymity. To this day, his whereabouts and whether he is even alive remain unknown. The youngest, Valentine Michael Manson, born in 1968 to Mary Brunner, was perhaps the most innocent of them all. Nicknamed Pooh Bear, he was just a baby when his father was arrested. After Brunner's imprisonment, Valentine was raised by his maternal grandparents in Wisconsin, where he took the name Michael Brunner. Unlike his half-brothers, he grew up loved, protected and sheltered from the Manson myth. Yet even he could not escape it entirely. As an adult, he later described his father as a man who was both my biological parent and the world's nightmare. In the ashes of Manson's downfall, his sons represented three separate fates: despair, disappearance, and distance. They were the living proof that evil leaves no one untouched, not even those born innocent of its crimes. As the decades passed, the Manson name became legend, a word synonymous with chaos, manipulation, and death. But for the three sons who bore that name, the battle was not for fame or forgiveness. It was for invisibility. They each fought in different ways to erase their father from their story, to reclaim the right to live without his shadow looming over every decision, every introduction, every breath. For Charles Manson Jr., the struggle ended tragically. His suicide in 1993 was not just an act of despair, but the culmination of a lifetime spent running from a surname that refused to die. Friends later said he lived with constant anxiety, afraid that people would discover who he really was. His son Manson's grandson later described him as a kind but broken man, unable to find peace in a world that would not let him forget his bloodline. His death left behind a haunting legacy of pain passed through generations, an echo of a curse that began long before he was born. Charles Luther Manson, The middle son succeeded in vanishing entirely. There are no verified photographs, no public records, no trace of his life beyond early childhood. Some believe he changed his name, moved abroad, and started over. Others think he withdrew from society completely. His silence became his salvation. In the absence of evidence, he became a phantom, the son who truly escaped his father by erasing himself from history. Michael Brunner, the youngest, took a different path. Raised by his maternal grandparents in Wisconsin, he lived a modest, disciplined life. For most of his youth, he avoided the topic of his parentage entirely. It wasn't until adulthood that he publicly acknowledged being Manson's son, and even then he did so with careful distance. "He was my biological father, nothing more," Michael once said. He rejected the idea of inheriting any darkness from Manson, insisting that nurture, not blood, defined who a person became. In interviews, Michael spoke of the absurd fascination the world still had with Charles Manson, the documentaries, the books, the songs. He understood why people were drawn to the story, but he also knew that for those who carried the name, fascination came at the cost of peace. He built a quiet life as a technician, a family man, a father, all the things his own father had failed to be. Through him, the Manson name found its first trace of redemption, not through denial, but through normalcy. His existence became the counterpoint to the myth proof that bloodlines do not dictate destiny, and that survival, not infamy, can be a legacy too. For decades, the world remained obsessed with Charles Manson. The madness in his stare, the cryptic philosophies, the endless interviews from behind bars. Yet while the world dissected his every word, his surviving son Michael Brunner was left to wrestle with the unspoken question, what does it mean to carry the blood of a man like that? Michael's revelation came quietly, not in confessionals or television interviews, but in his own understanding of who he was. He once explained that growing up, his grandparents shielded him from Manson's infamy. They told him only what was necessary, that his mother, Mary Brunner, had been involved with a dangerous man and that his father was not someone he needed to know. It wasn't until his teenage years that Michael fully grasped the scale of his father's crimes. He was stunned, repulsed, but not defined by it. "He may have been my father," he later said, "but he was never my family." This distinction became his emotional turning point. For Michael, rejecting the myth of Charles Manson wasn't enough. He had to dismantle the fascination surrounding him. He spoke of how the media turned Manson into a perverse icon, forgetting the suffering of his victims and glorifying the cult mystique. Michael's tone was not angry, but weary, the fatigue of someone who has lived a lifetime being asked to answer for another man's sins. For him, freedom came not through denial, but through clarity. He learned to separate genetics from identity, to understand that heritage does not equal destiny. He chose education over rage work, over notoriety, family over chaos. In doing so, he became the quiet opposite of his father, the anti-Manson living proof that decency can outgrow darkness. When asked whether he ever visited Charles Manson in prison, Michael's answer was simple: no. "I didn't need to. I already knew everything I needed to know." That choice to walk away, to sever the bloodline spiritually, even if not biologically, was his rebellion, his healing, and his redemption. While the world continued to mythologize Charles Manson, Michael Brunner's silence became the only voice that mattered. It spoke to the tragedy of being born into a name cursed by violence, and to the courage of those who refused to let that name define them. As time moved forward, and the fascination with Charles Manson faded into documentary reruns and true crime archives, Michael Brunner continued his quiet evolution into a life of stability and purpose. While his father's image remained frozen in time, defiant, unrepentant, and immortalized as a symbol of evil, Michael aged beyond the mythology. He built what his father never could: a family, a routine, a place in the world that existed without chaos. After years of hiding from his own identity, Michael eventually chose to confront it on his terms. He began to speak publicly, not to defend his father, but to reclaim his narrative. In rare interviews, he explained how he refused to let the name Manson dictate who he became. He lived under his adoptive name, worked as a technician, and focused on the ordinary details of life that his father had rejected. He described himself simply as a man who works a father and someone who believes in peace. Michael's reflections revealed how the Manson story had distorted the idea of family itself. His father's so-called family was built on control, submission, and delusion. Michael's own family was built on patience, honesty, and distance from the past. That contrast became the truest measure of his identity. Meanwhile, the broader world still tried to define him. Filmmakers, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts sought him out, eager to attach his name to their retellings of Manson's crimes. But Michael rarely agreed. He understood that curiosity about Charles Manson would never fade, but he refused to let his life become an extension of that curiosity. In doing so, he preserved something his father had destroyed in others: choice. Today, Michael Brunner's life remains largely private. He is neither an advocate nor an apologist, neither victim nor inheritor. He stands as a reminder that, even when born into darkness, one can choose not to carry it forward. His existence proves that identity is not what you inherit. It's what you build, in spite of it. In his silence and his restraint, Michael achieved something far greater than fame or absolution. He broke the cycle. Charles Manson died in 2017 at the age of 83, still unrepentant, still claiming he had never killed anyone. To the end, he remained the embodiment of twisted charisma, a small man who once convinced others that he was a god. Yet for all the noise he created, his death left behind only silence. No crowds mourned him. No family claimed his ashes with pride. The world at last seemed to exhale. But even in death, Manson's legacy lived on, not in his message, but in the quiet endurance of his sons. Each carried his name differently: Charles Manson Jr., who lost himself to despair; Charles Luther Manson, who disappeared and became a ghost; and Michael Brunner, who chose to confront the past and then move beyond it. Their stories reveal the true cost of Manson's delusion, the way his hunger for control destroyed not only strangers, but those bound to him by blood. Michael once said that he didn't hate his father. He simply felt nothing for him. That indifference, that calm rejection of Manson's mythology, might be the most powerful judgment ever delivered. While his father sought followers, Michael sought freedom. Where Manson built his empire on chaos, his son built a quiet life of order. In that contrast lies the final human truth. Evil can be born, but it does not have to be inherited. Today, the name Manson still provokes fascination, headlines, and fear. Yet the truest legacy of the story belongs not to the man who preached destruction, but to the children who refused to become him. Their lives, fractured, hidden, and resilient, stand as evidence that even from the darkest roots, something human can still survive. And so, decades after the screams faded from the California hills, the story of Charles Manson's sons reminds us of one enduring fact. History may remember the monster, but it is the survivors who give it meaning.